and good evening to all of the colleagues. Greetings to the President, Mr. Paul Kgale, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope I represent the Social Housing Regulatory Authority, and we are on the verge of signing an agreement with the BBCBE, and I hope that very soon that will be the case, or certainly during the month of November. So colleagues, I'm just going to share a brief 9-slide presentation with you, if you'll let me just put that up quickly. All right, and then colleagues, the topic for tonight that we're talking about is the response plan for the construction sector as a result of COVID-19. So the input that the SHRA would like to make at this meeting is beyond the health and safety issue to what we actually do and what the plans are as a construction sector, where the Black Business Council for the Built Environment has its primary interest. And I'm going to take the meeting or the webinar through just 4 brief stages. First of all, what is the problem statement? Where do we find ourselves at the moment is where I'm going to start. Secondly, what is government's plans, noting that the SHRA is obviously an agency of national government and therefore an extension of government. Thirdly, when we then implement government's plans, together with yourselves, of course, what is the method that we implement them through? How do we make sure that we achieve the transformative results that are necessary? And lastly, to touch on the hidden hand of corruption and the threat of that. So, colleagues, to start with, what is the problem statement? The problem statement is on this graph and the next. The problem statement has been worsened by COVID-19, but it existed way before COVID-19. And that problem statement is really one of inequality, and it's really one of poverty. So this graph that's in front of you now compares our country, South Africa, with other emerging market economies. And if you just look at this graph, if you understand how the Gini coefficient works, we are an extremely acutely uneven or unequal society. In fact, since 1993, we've become slightly more unequal as opposed to less unequal. But if you look on the red line, that is the South Africa's level of inequality, which sits at a Gini coefficient of 0.63%, whereas other emerging economies in the world sit with an average Gini coefficient of 0.45%, almost 0.2% better than South Africa sits at. So that is very severe. Secondly, there's wealth inequality, not only because of how wealth is distributed, but because of the levels of unemployment. So what this graph does, again, is it compares South Africa's level of employment with the level of employment in other emerging economies. The emerging economies are the blue graphs, the South African unemployment rates are the red graphs. So as you see from that, South African youth unemployment sits at more than 50% compared to other emerging economies that have a youth unemployment rate of only 15%. South Africa's unemployment rate overall sits at 30% compared to other emerging economies of about only 6%. And of course, this unemployment problem has got worse since COVID-19. If you look at how income is distributed in our society, the bottom 40% of income earners only earn 7% of the income of the country. The middle 40% earn 25% of the income of the country, and the top 20% of all income earners in the country earn 68% of the income. So obviously with a low growth economy, which is what we're in currently, this problem is worsened because it's very difficult to create jobs in a low growth economy. Some people believed, and don't forget, we went through very high growths many years ago, although not since 2008. The economy is pretty much stagnated since 2008. But in the early years post-democracy, we enjoyed a very high level of economic growth, but did it improve the level of inequality? No, it didn't. So high growth rates don't by definition result in a reduction in inequality. What is obviously therefore required is structural economic change and changes in the patterns of ownership if you want to really achieve higher levels of equality and growth. One of the problems, and it's documented in this slide here, one of the problems, because I'm speaking on behalf of a small portion of the construction sector, which is the social housing sector, is getting financing into the industry that members of BBCBE work in. Getting that financing is very difficult. What this graph shows, and it gives you all the detail, is at the moment, the debt financing knocking around in the social housing industry at the moment is a very small 1.65 billion rand of signed loan agreements. The bad news is only 19% of those loans come from pure private sector loans. The rest of the loans come, in fact, from state and parastatal organizations. So what do we try to do? First of all, what's on this slide is really cut and paste from the NDP, the National Development Plan. What the plan many, many years ago already said that we had to do is we had to create an inclusive economy, a growing economy that is inclusive. We needed to eliminate poverty. We needed to create inclusive growth, and it needed to be a measurable qualitative transformation that would be achieved through changes in pattern of ownership. We will also set a task of building capabilities, including in the state sector and the capacity of the state, and building partnerships and leadership. But if you look at where we sit now, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Tito Mboweni, has just delivered his budget address to Parliament earlier this week. And just let me give you 6 of the fairly horrifying takeouts from that speech. First of all, economic contraction. This is the problem statement. Economic contraction is projected to be 7.8%. Our economy will contract by 7.8% in the current year that we are in. Job losses are huge, which has shot the unemployment rate beyond the 30%. The gross debt that the country carries at the moment, according to the Minister of Finance, is sitting at 4 trillion. And what we have to borrow as a country every day to make everything work is a further 2.1 billion rand per day. So the risk that we face as a country, if we don't get back onto a growth path post-COVID-19, the risk that we face is a contraction in gross domestic product and the creation of many more dependency on outside lenders. As soon as we have to do that, and we need to put our money into servicing debt instead of investing in infrastructure, then we are in a terrible problem. So that brings us to a more positive part of the presentation that I'm making, and that is, what are government's plans? There have been a lot of announcements made recently on what government's plans are. I think it's well known by now, and there was a 2-day webinar like this that happened earlier this week. The economic restructuring and recovery plan has been announced by the president, and it's being driven through Infrastructure South Africa. An office has been established by national government called the Infrastructure Investment Office, and a national infrastructure fund has been created, not only to turn around the economic decline pre-COVID-19, but especially to turn it around post-COVID-19. What this program aims to do is to unlock a further to unlock 1 trillion rands worth of investment into infrastructure investment over the next 4 years. At the moment, although the country's aiming, as was announced in that meeting by Dr. Ramakgopa, what the country's aiming at is investing 10% of its GDP in infrastructure investment that creates jobs and creates sustainability. It's a long way to go because it's hovering less than 6%. At the moment, the investment in infrastructure is hovering around about 5.9%. There needs to be a shift in the spending, and the target being set by that office is to increase the spending investment in growth investment, which is infrastructure, at a rate of a further 7.8% per annum. Now, here's the good news for the social housing program, and the good news for a lot of the BBCBE members is that included in the Minister of Finance's speech earlier this week is an announcement of subsidies to the value of 2.2 billion rand to support the social housing program that is overseen by the SHRA. And the Minister of Finance also announced that over the next 10 years, in addition to the grant portion and the subsidy portion that will come from government, that government hopes to leverage through a blended financing model a total of a further 20 billion into the sector over the next 10 years. So, colleagues, where does this take us as far as our own responsibility, the responsibilities of BBCBE, the responsibilities of the SHRA, the responsibilities of everybody who's a player in the economy? We need to really interrogate the method that we are going to use to invest this money in the economy. Just an observation, if the objective is, as the NDP has said, that the growth has to be inclusive and that it has to eradicate poverty and eradicate inequality, then we have to do things in a new and better way. One of the observations is that perhaps what we need is a far greater emphasis on a much more institutionalized approach to investing in the economy and investing in organizations, whether those organizations are state organizations, semi-government, what people used to call parastatals, or private corporations. We need to spend this money in the economy in a way that takes a much more prolonged period, or achieves a much more prolonged period of sustainability on an intergenerational way that is inclusive and which is empowering. Examples have often been made in the recent few months and years about corporations like the former Eskom, the former ISCO, excuse me, as well as Sasol in its heyday, as well as even institutions like Eskom. These were institutionalized transformation vehicles that aimed at achieving much broader-based transformation in the economy. At the moment, to some extent, we are responsible for having a race format, race in the sense of an athletic race, not race as in demographics, a race format that is based on rewarding short sprints. And the result of doing transformation in this way is that the beneficiaries of transformation often become competitors, competing with each other. And that's not going to work, because transformation needs to be a team sport. So the other observation that, as the SHRA, we've also made is that transformation, if it's really going to be sustained, prolonged, and deep, also needs to allow the players to be much more focused. To have such a scattered approach across various different sporting codes or across various different industries, the health industry, the education industry, the construction industry, often does not allow the kind of focus that is necessary for long-term sustained intergenerational transformation, which is needed. So this input is an observation to almost make a call for us to relook at our methods, our modalities to implement transformation and to spend this infrastructure money so that we take a longer range career development approach to try to achieve transformation. Fortunately, in the announcements that have been made in the infrastructure investment program so far, it's been made clear that it's not a short sprint. The investment is not purely going into building the stuff and constructing the stuff, but into the long-term management and maintenance of what gets built. So here's a challenge to all of us. Perhaps we need to relook at our language. We talk very often, we use phrases like opportunity, and we use phrases like benefit. And we talk a lot about the individual who's a player and who's a member, but we don't talk enough about building strong, deep, sustainable organizations and institutions. And maybe this fragmentation and this unnecessary competition is what's keeping us away from enjoying the real opportunity. I've given on this slide, in fact, it's the next slide, what is a real opportunity, because a real opportunity is something created through having a consistent and sustained presence. And therefore, fragmentation of focus actually undermines the opportunity for the possibility for real opportunity. What is a benefit? A benefit is the reward that materializes as a consequence of a long-term, sustained and consistent training and competing and playing in this space. We have, as the SHRA, many, let's say, corpses of partly completed projects that have not managed to be completed because the approach to these projects has been short-term thinking, the short-term sprint thinking, as opposed to the long-term sustainable thinking. And we've got projects like this all over the country: Klerksdorp, Riverlea, Ekurhuleni, East London. So this move away from the short sprint to a long-term sustained organization-based transformation approach is becoming very, very important. Lastly, if we are going to make anything of this and make sure that it counts ultimately, the way that we move into the post COVID-19 era, the way that we spend the trillion rand that is being sought by government, the way that we use the grants, the way that we format transformation deals, empowerment deals, etc. We have to stare the horror of corruption right in the eye, because corruption in the housing industry particularly, and in the construction industry particularly, has a very particular form. It's a very crude form, and it's a very violent form of corruption, because the people that hurt the most are the people that can afford to hurt the least, because they are the most vulnerable. The other victims that we have found in our observation as the SHRA, and even before my tenure here at the SHRA, is that a lot of the victims of corruption are Black-owned businesses or Black-initiated businesses. And as soon as fat has to be built into the supply chain to make corrupt deals or kickbacks or extortion give room for that, it effectively compromises the financial viability of a lot of the projects, which is why things go south. So the role of the SHRA, and I'll end here, Program Director Nandi, the role of the SHRA must be well understood just as one agency of trying to assist national government with a post-COVID-19 economic recovery plan. And that role is to make sure that there is quality governance and that the state is an enabler, an effective state, as it says in the NDP, which includes protecting the supply chain against the risk of corruption, which we've learned in recent years is the biggest threat to transformation in the country. Thank you, Program Director.